Okay, everyone, we're gonna have another quick video. This is just gonna be the theory for this week, and we're gonna get started right now. So, once again, we're gonna review. We're gonna talk about our elements of art and then our principles of design. And I've chosen three for this week. We're gonna talk about value and color, which are two elements of art, and then contrast, which is a principle of design. All right, so first one we're gonna talk about is value. So value is lightness and darkness. Okay, it is it's the difference between light blue and dark blue. It's the difference between black and white. It's just all of the different grays and whether they're incredibly like bright gray or incredibly dark gray, and then the ultimate black and white kind of stuff. So when we talk about value, when I say something about it at all, this is what we're referring to. It's how light or how dark something is. Okay, and value is relative. So you can have a very very dark scene with one little area of like a slightly lighter gray, and it'll make a really intense difference. For instance, if we look over here at these guys, just the grays on these are very, very close to each other, but their differences are enough to create enough contrast so that we can see and understand a lot of the form on these bodies. So value comes in two different varieties. We have local value, and then we have light value. Okay, so local value is the value that is just the object's material value. Okay, so if you have on a white t-shirt and a black jacket, those are exactly as they sound, a white t-shirt and a black jacket. Okay, if we look here at this little 3D scene, we have an environment here that does not have any light. It's a void of light. I know that we can see that this cube here has a light side, a medium side, and a dark side, but those are actually the material's local values. That's a light red on top, a medium red on the right, and then a dark red on the left. And that's how it's made. Same with this over here. This is a dark gray, a medium gray, and a light gray. These are purposely made so that they're easy to differentiate. But as you can see, there's no shadows, there's no highlights, there's nothing, there's no reflective light. And this is essentially just what the values of these objects are without light, how they look like when light is not touching them or affecting them. Okay. So once we have the local value figured out, once we know if we have a light shirt and some dark trousers, then we can start working on the actual light value. Okay, so local value, like I said, so this house has, white barn area, a black roof, and we get the little trees thing. When we start adding in lighting, that's going to affect all of that stuff. Okay, so if we have a nice bright beam of light on this house, then we're going to actually see some shadows. We're going to see highlights. We're going to see bright areas and dark areas that are being affected by a light source. Okay, so we have the same scene from up here. Now it's actually being affected by a light source, and you can see that it's dramatically changed the scene. We have our light here. We have a gradient against the wall where we can see where the light is propagating from the brightest area to a slightly darker area. And then we have a cast shadow. This is a shadow that is being made by the cube. And now you can see that we have a light side. There's a gradient from a lighter to a slightly lower value red. And then we have a medium and a dark side, plus the cast shadow on the ground itself. Okay. Now, color also can have a value too. It's not just gray, black, and white. Okay, like we've talked about earlier, you can have light blue jeans on, or you can have dark blue jeans on. Color has value, just like this red has value. You can have light versions of them and dark versions of them, and those are going to be affected by light. So we're talking about value. We're going to differentiate the difference between local value and light value, and I'm going to make sure when we talk about it that we point it out. This is a great example from one of my favorite artists, Poyer Jablonski, of using light value and local value to create a very strong piece, and it's all using color. Okay, so we have some highlighted areas on the torso, and we have some midtones, and you see how simply and close they are. They're not very different. There's a couple areas of high contrast, like these really dark cast shadows, but they're not very different. And then we have the jacket, which is very, very dark, and then there's subtle little shifts of gray inside of it that help us understand some of the form. The mask is this mid-tone sort of gray with slight highlights that indicate that it's got some area of light, and then there's dark shadows here where the legs are hitting the ground, and all of this awesome, beautiful stuff. So this is a wonderful example of use of local value and light value. Okay, so we talked about color, light value having color. So that's going to bring us to our next topic, which is color. So color theory is very vast, and I'm not going to get into everything because it really has its own class at CS Arts. So we're not going to get too much into it. And I just wanted to pick out some stuff to focus on for this class, for this next project, so you guys have a little bit more to work with, okay? So color is hues. When we say hues, we mean color. It's all the same stuff, okay? And there's different kinds of color. There's, the most saturated pure form of hues. We call these chroma as well. Then we have muted colors. We have chromatic grays, and we have achromatic grays, which just means that there's no color. When it's achromatic, there's no color. But when it's chromatic, there's a color in the gray. So it's not just black and white, which is an achromatic gray. A chromatic gray is like a gray with a little bit of green or a little bit of blue, that kind of stuff. And this makes up the majority of the colors in any scene that you guys see. Most of it's going to have a bit of gray in it. You're very, very rarely going to have a pure form of a color represented. And if it is, it's going to be very, very, very loud. It's going to say, hey, look at me. Okay? So we also have something called color theory, which is the use of color to do certain things and the effects that they have on people. So one of the, or two of them that we're going to pick out. These are the most common and the most simple to learn. We have complementary color, and we have harmonious colors. So complementary colors are colors that work really, really well together, okay? They are very, very different. If we look on the color wheel, we have our first two examples right here. We have blue and orange. If we look at where blue is and we look at orange, they're at the opposite ends of this color wheel, okay? Green and red go really well together. If we look at where they are, red is over here, green is over here, yellow and blue, or I'm sorry, yellow and purple, yellow and purple, all right? So complementary colors are opposites of the color wheel, and they're very attractive next to each other because they have high contrast. They are very loud and they want to be seen. So if we place two objects next to each other that are these two colors, they're going to draw our attention. We have harmonious colors next, which are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. And these ones go this way. So these ones go up and down like that, and these ones go this way. So they also, and one thing on complementary, they're generally going to be contrasting temperatures. So color has temperature too, cool and warm. So cool colors are generally going to be, the blues and purples and stuff like that. And then the warm colors are going to be the oranges and reds. But temperature is relative. So you could say that yellow is a warm color when you compare it to blue, right? It's warmer. But when you compare yellow to purple, which is a very, very, very hot color, it's much cooler, okay? So color temperature is relative, and the complementary colors are generally going to be opposite temperatures when we talk about them. Now back to harmonious. These are going to be colors that are next to each other, and these create a sense of calmness and serenity. So when you have lots of blue variations in something, it lets us stay calm and relax and chill, and we don't have so much of a problem. Same with the warms too. We have nice warm harmonious colors next to each other. They represent a sense of serenity that we generally recognize in nature. So you can see this looks like a sunset. Maybe this looks like the ocean. You don't generally see complementary colors too often in nature, but there are like really, really wonderful examples of it, like sunflowers against blue sky, or Christmas, or ocean and a sunset. Sometimes these things are represented naturally, but it's very rare in complementary colors. Harmonious is much more natural. Okay, and then last thing I want to say about grays too. When you mix complementary colors together, purple and yellow, if you look here, if you trace your hand and you mix a certain percentage of colors, like let's say I mix this yellow and this blue here, if I meet them halfway in between this one and this one, you're going to get the color that they kind of make. So this sort of chromatic gray that they make. Same with this. If you mix yellow with purple, you're going to get not necessarily an achromatic gray, because this is like there's no color, but you're going to get a gray. You're going to get a gross kind of muddy looking gray. Same with all of these colors. If you mix their complements with each other, they're going to make a gray. But let's say if you mix like a red with a blue, you're going to get a purple. If you mix a red with this kind of blue, you're going to get this sort of purple, okay? So that's color, really quick color theory. Let's go on to contrast. We talked about how complementary colors create a lot of contrast. They're very loud. That is one way of creating attractive contrast. And contrast is the difference of things, okay? And you can have low contrast and you can have high contrast. So let's look at another example of Poiter-Jablonski. This is a very high contrast image, not only in the value, which is white, black, but also in the color. So we have this very saturated, very, very, very bright red, and then we have these no color areas around it. having color and then having no color creates contrast. And then it's also the only thing that is red on this piece other than the hair. And then there's a little bit of here down to help create some balance, but this large area of red is isolated in this piece, and so this creates a focal point, and that's what contrast is really the best thing for, is creating focal points. So if I create high contrast in an area that doesn't make sense, like if I have a big thing of red right here, we're gonna look over here, and there's not really anything worth seeing there. So if I was like to paint a little spot right here, okay, so look, we've got, I've got this nice bright red spot there, and there's nothing to see here, and it's drawing attention away from this, right? We don't want that, okay? We have another example of great contrast here, of low contrast and high contrast. This is one from Jacob Rosalski. He's a very, very great Polish painter. So this area back here, there's a lot of low contrast. This purple, despite being, a nice purple, is pretty decently close to all of this other purple back here. There's not a whole major difference, right? But when you look at the figure in the foreground, there's black in there, there's like dark browns, there's all kinds of stuff. And that against white is creating a high contrast area. And that is creating a strong focal point, okay? So you guys should see a trend right now. Strong focal points generally have high contrast. And there's lots of different ways to do it, okay? This is a value contrast, okay? This right here is a color isolated contrast, or just an isolation contrast, where it's just one thing that looks like that, so we're gonna draw our attention to it. Over here is value. We have the darkest area against a very light area, and it's gonna create an area of attention that we wanna look at. And then we have our secondary focal point, which is another area of contrast, but not very much, so it doesn't compete with our main area of contrast right here. We have next shape contrast, okay? So this here, if you look at the values, they're all pretty muted. There's not a lot of black, and there's not a lot of white. There's a lot of gray and a lot of color that has its own value, so there's probably a lot of grays in here. And in fact, we can even do this fun thing where we can go on to image, mode, and then we go to grayscale, merge, and discard. And look, we can take all the color away, and we can see we have just this, cornucopia of grays, right? So there's not a color contrast and there's not a value contrast here. There's a shape contrast. So there's this big giant shape here that is not like anything else on the piece, and so it's going to draw our attention to it. So this is another way to create contrast, using shapes that are different than all the other shapes around to draw our attention and focus it in a specific area. And then finally we have some temperature contrast and color contrast, you could say. So this is a wonderful piece that has a great example of using a very cool color, a green and a blue. You can see there's some gray, and then a very, very hot color, this really, really intense orange and yellow. So these two next to each other, they're creating really, really strong contrast because they're different. They're very, very different. If you look back on the color wheel, they're very far away from each other. So we're drawn there. We're drawn to that area. If you look here, there's not a lot of contrast in color. There's, everything's very close. Same over here, everything's pretty close. Same over here, everything's pretty close. There's some contrast here. You got lots of cool and lots of intense form here. And if you look though, this is pretty much very, very close to our focal point, so it's okay to have it there. You don't want to have this intensity down here, right? This is not going to contribute to our ability to stay focused. It actually is drawing attention away from our focal point, right? So, to review, you guys are going to focus on a few things, okay? We're going to focus on contrast, value, and color on this one. You're going to worry about local value, and you're going to worry about light value. You're going to worry about choosing colors that make sense to your scene. If you have a very intense, scary, frightening, excitable, crazy scene, you're choosing complementary colors. If you have a very relaxing, calming, soft, and serene place, you're going to choose harmonious colors. And then finally, you're going to make sure that you have high contrast in your focal areas and that everything is easily recognizable and understood from a distance, okay? And you can choose a isolated contrast, you can choose value contrast, shape contrast, or temperature color contrast. All right, so that's it for this video. Thank you guys.